All right, now, last week we had a big discussion about who is the high priest. Didn't we? Seemed like there was another verse. Oh. Yeah, you know what? I wanted to add another one to this. Who did we conclude as the high priest? Is that true? We concluded, who was the high priest? Caiaphas, because of verse what? 24. All right, so let's start at verse 13. And led him away. Father, bless now. Yes.
In John 11th chapter, 49 through 57 and 57, it says, now both chief priests.
Oh. John 11. Yeah, I was going to bring up, how far do we want to go? Yeah, let's, 11, give me that verse.
Starting from 49 to 57, it says, both now chief priests and the Pharisees are given commandments. So they're talking about chief high priests.
Well, let's add that one in there. John 11, verse 57. Father, bless now our lesson today. That there would be understanding, not fogginess. I don't think it's going to be all that important. Now, if in the King James issue, it could be. It could make a difference. Now, reading Ruckman, he goes into the Old Testament where, and they're called priests, and he said, well, some will argue that it doesn't state high priest, that there was more than one high priest back then, and that was in, could be 1 Kings someplace. It would have been the son of Abiathar, or he mentioned that. And when he goes into his argument, it was several pages, and I tell you the truth, the last few days I haven't felt the best. Not that I was sick, but I was, by the end of Friday, I was on edge. Having gone 6, 7, 8 hours straight, I don't know why, I felt that way. Sometimes I feel that way. Then Friday night, I went to see my mother, I crashed. Last night, and I usually don't do that. I was really, really tired. So anyway, let's look at John 11:57. Now, both chief priests, it says that, all right? Now, go to John 18, where we are. And led him away to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that, oh, wait a minute. Wait, hold on. Oh, verse 57. Let's go back there. Let's go back there. Now, both the chief priests. Is the chief priest the high priest?
It's simple.
The word both could also be referring to chief priests and Pharisees.
Oh, yeah. The word both.
It could be either way.
Yeah.
Yeah, priest is plural, so it's probably the priest. It's probably the chief priest. I'm wrong.
All right. Well, one is saying the high priest. The other is saying it's referring to chief priests and the Pharisees.
Dana mentioned verse 49. Right here.
Say that again?
Dana mentioned
Verse 49. All right.
In chapter 11.
Yeah, I'm going back there. 11:49. And one of them named kind of being the high priest. See, Caiaphas is the high priest.
According to that.
Yeah. So 11, let's John 11. I'm just writing all these verses down. If this ever comes up again, and It's in the notes. All right, now, go back, if you would, to John 18. All right, so that was a monkey wrench. Anybody know what a monkey wrench is? We were in a store yesterday that was selling antique hardware. They have all antique stuff in there. I don't know if they had any new stuff in there. They must have had new stuff in there. And then they had displays in there. It's like Layman's. It's not as like Layman's, and it's certainly not priced like Layman's. And they had a box with monkey wrenches in it. I said, wow, you got monkey wrenches. I said, I don't even know where my monkey wrenches are. I wouldn't have sold them. And then the guy, he wasn't a kid. He was 30, 40 years old. He said, well, he pulled out a pipe wrench. He said, I always thought this was a monkey wrench. I said, that's not a monkey wrench, that's a pipe wrench. I said, this is a monkey wrench. So the owner, I assume he was the owner, he said, well, the monkey wrench is for something that's square, and a pipe wrench is something that's round. He said, yeah. I don't know, why did they ever get rid of the monkey wrench? Monkey wrench?
It's a crescent wrench and channelized.
Well, to me, the monkey wrench is even better.
Well, as far as grip, it probably is.
You know, it is. So, and why did I bring that up? Oh, you threw a monkey wrench in. Yes, the expression, the monkey wrench. All right, verse 13. And led him away to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that year. He was the high priest that year. Now Caiaphas was he which gave counsel to the Jews, was expedient that one man should die for the people. Now in reading this, I'm kind of reading this for the first time to show this verse. And Simon Peter followed Jesus, so did another disciple. That disciple was known unto the high priest, and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest, which would have been Caiaphas. But Peter stood at the door without. Then went out that other disciple, which was known unto the high priest, and spake unto her that kept the door, brought in Peter. Then said the damsel that kept the door unto Peter, art not thou also one of this man's disciples? He saith, I am not. The servants and officers stood there, who had made a fire of coals, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. The high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples, asked Jesus of his disciples, now which high priest is that? Is that Annas or Caiaphas? We've been saying high priest right along is Caiaphas, but he goes first to Annas first. And then, now look at verse 24. Now Annas, now I didn't read beyond 20. Now Annas had sent him bound unto Caiaphas. I'm just...
No, he's at least before Annas, right there. That's what verse 13 says. That's where the questioning is coming from Annas. And
Yeah, but he didn't send him to Caiaphas until after verse 24. So who's the high priest there in verse 19? Is that Annas or Caiaphas?
no, that's Annas.
Yeah, that's Annas.
Yeah.
That's the way it appears.
Okay.
When I looked it up after service last week, and I don't know where they got this from, they said that Annas was the high priest that the Jews recognized, and Rome came in and appointed.
Yeah, that's what I say. So, yeah, David.
Wouldn't it be more or less a cultural thing, because he's the father-in-law? So it's in the family line. They always tended to give the older one first say.
Yeah, what do you call that in business? Starts with the N. Nepotism.
But that's the way it's supposed to
Well, no. It's what happens in the
be.
ministry.
Not father-in-law.
Yeah, but what happens in the ministry? Who's taking the church over here? Yeah, you see? And what do I say? You need to be God called, not mama called. Or, they inherit the business. It's not a good thing. Yeah, go ahead.
We came this morning, he was contending that Annas was the official high priest. Caiaphas was the legal high priest appointed by Rome.
Right, that's what Joe just said. And I agree with that. Yeah, I agree with that. So in verse 19, who's the high priest?
Annas, because he's still in Annas right now.
And then who's the high priest in verse 15 and verse 16? Or could that be in reference to Caiaphas? I don't know.
No, because it's not Caiaphas, it's still is.
Yeah, he's saying.
He doesn't go to Caiaphas until 24.
Could they be in the same building?
No, because he sends him bound to Caiaphas.
Yeah, well, I know, I'm just throwing these things out. So we're saying the high priest is called the high priest Annas in verse 19, in between 13 and 19, and then the appointed high priest is verse 24 on.
Yes.
Okay. Now, is that as far as we want to go with this? Because we could dig further. In Ruckman's book, it's not called the high priest, it's called priest, plural, and he said they had two high priests back then. Now, I was so ever study us who we've all been in school, have you ever studied so long that if you don't stop you might end up in the hospital? And I don't mean much study, it's in Ecclesiastes, weariness to the flesh. You know, you could be digging so long you could end up in the hospital, and the same with studying. I mean, I was too blitzed. He goes into quite a big detail about it. If we don't want to pursue that, I won't pursue that. Yeah.
Why did they do that?
It was a King James Bible issue.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a King James issue with the switching of words, and he goes into a lot of detail on that King James stuff. You know, for those that want to be so-called experts, the ones that you're listening to, or, you know, you're on the Almost Christian radio station, you may hear this or that, he can tear those people apart, and he's not the only one. There's others out there who can do that. They know their business. They know their Greek, they know their Hebrew. They're not just giving lip service. They get into the past particle preposition, and they get into that, of the words and what they mean in English. And these people, they're smarter than me. So I had to read up on it. Now, do we want to go there? Otherwise, we'll just skip it. I mean, it's not going to help you with your apple pie, you know. But I think we're all in agreement that the high priest, there's got to be a real high priest that Jesus stood before. And the general consensus is Annas. And Caiaphas is this nepotism appointed by Rome, keeping the peace, the public peace, peace with Rome, peace with, as this what do you call that? Liaison, sort of speak, as that kind of a function. And when we go to John 4, verse 6, there could have been 4. John and Alexander are mentioned. Doesn't it say John and Alexander in 4:6, Dana?
Yeah, I'm just curious, what made the Romans pick Caiaphas?
Oh, I don't know. Who knows? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if there's an answer to that. We could go on some cultural or historical things that may not be biblical. Yes?
Probably a general answer would be that he would be loyal enough to Rome that they could trust him not to be rebellious.
Oh, yeah, loyal to Rome, a spy. This is what's going on in the Sanhedrin. Are there any rumblings with the Jews? He might tell.
For some reason, he'd be loyal to Rome, whether it be money.
As a spy, you know what? There was I don't know if that, I didn't include it either in the sermon or in this. As a spy, it was they killed, David killed everybody so that they wouldn't tell on him, right? Get rid of spies. So he could have been as a spy, as a what do you call that? As a plant, as
A mole.
a part.
A mole.
Oh, okay, that's the slang word, an informant.
Yeah.
Oh, a mole, yeah. Okay. So the consensus is we won't pursue it. I'll go ahead and read it anyway when I'm awake and see if there's anything worth pursuing there. that's going to add more light to it. But he did make mention that there were multiple high priests in the Old Testament. All right. So anyway, I'll do a little investigating. All right, and those that remember, Jesus said, and I think this is where we concluded that they had the greater sin. Remember, Jesus said they had the greater sin because they turned them over. Is that there's different levels in hell. You know, Adolf Hitler is going to burn more than Joseph Stalin. They're burning more than others, and so on. All right, verse 12, and bound him. I don't know where I read this. This could have been Arthur Pink. Jesus was bound to set us free. I mean, imagine that. They bind him. You know, a play on words. We obtain freedom by his incarceration, right? He's bound and we're free. All right, verse 13. We didn't, this is beyond our notes now, right? Verse 13, and led him away to Annas first. All right, willing, submitted. The first Adam, how did he leave the garden? He was what? Driven, yes. All right, so the contrast of the first Adam, the last Adam. One is driven from, the other is led to. And as we say about a sheep, they are led to the slaughter. Okay, led willingly to the priest. Turn, if you would, and we don't have to go back to Genesis 3:24. We know it says there that they drove Adam and Eve from the garden. All right, turn, if you would, to Leviticus 17. Leviticus 17, verse 5. To the end that the children of Israel may bring their sacrifices which they offer in the open field, even that they may bring them unto the Lord, unto the door of the tabernacle, unto the priest. It doesn't say led, driven, but the sheep is led willingly to the priest. And the sheep are taken to the sheep gate. Go, if you would. Probably this is where a lot of this took place. You probably went through the sheep gate. Turn, if you would, to Nehemiah. Nehemiah 3. Ezra, Nehemiah, in the building of the wall there, verse 1. Why do I have? Builded the sheep, and they builded the sheep gate. Eliashib, the high priest, rose up with his brethren, the priests, and they builded the sheep gate. Well, how fitting for the high priest to build the sheep gate, because the sheep would have been brought to the priest. I didn't see that before. How fitting that is the ones that would build that gate, right? I think that's kind of interesting. 32. Verse 32 of the same chapter, and between the going up the corning under the sheep gate repaired the goldsmiths and the merchants. So it makes the full swing, the entire wall. So beginning to end, I'm sure they're going in a circle. Hey, I wonder if it's interesting if they go clockwise or counterclockwise, if there's something to do with that in the building of the gates. Nehemiah 12, verse 39. Nehemiah 12, verse 39. So the high priest actually, and did the high priest, let me see. And the high priest rose up with his brethren, and the high priest did not, he humbled himself and built. Who did not build, by the way? Certain, and I don't mean all, but on a certain gate, some of the noblemen did not build. They refused. They didn't want to get their fingernails dirty. Which gate is that? It should be recorded in number 3. Some of the noblemen would not. Verse 5. Next unto them the Tekoites repaired, but their nobles put not their necks to the work of their Lord. All right, so chapter 3, Nehemiah 3, verse 5. They did not put their necks to the work of their Lord. So in the scheme of things, what would that cost them as far as Christians are concerned? Assuming all these people are Christians, making them Christians. What would it cost them by not working? Yeah, the reward on the other side. And we're going to be preaching about that a little bit today at 3 points. 3 points, 3 words. It's really one word, one way the word is used in the Bible. Yes?
I should have, when you study this more about the high priest, which
Yeah.
one has lineage? Because they have some.
Oh, you know what? Now that you mention that, he brought that up. Now, and I do remember reading that. He mentions the lines that this came through. Yeah, he does mention that. I'll go ahead and read that and see if there's anything more. He does mention the lineage in that. All right, Nehemiah 12, verse 39. Yeah, you're right. He does mention that. You see how it's important that we throw this. I don't have a corner on the market for brains, you know, right? If we throw these things out, what does it mean? We're all thinking, right? Verse 39, 12:39 from the fish gate, even under the sheep gate, and all right. So it's just mentioned there. John 5:2. Bethesda Baptist Church, John 5:2, the pool of Bethesda. I'm sorry. John 5:2. Now there's by the sheep market a pool. And that sheep, it's called, and notice market is italicized. There's a pool. And which is fitting where all these people that need healing are at the sheep gate. All right. Back, if you would, to verses 13 and 14, the priest. Let's just, I go through this whole thing again. And I don't feel led to go through this again. Let's go to 2 verses. I just underlined the word priest, Ananias and Caiaphas. Go to Exodus. Obviously, you could preach our Lord and Savior through this because the priest was the priest until when? Until he died, yes. Until he died, and the people were not freed until he died. All right, verse 15.
What book? Chapter?
I'm sorry, Exodus 40, verse 15. And thou shalt anoint them as thou didst anoint their father, that they may minister unto me in the priest's office, for their anointing shall surely be an everlasting priesthood throughout their generations. Sorry, so it's everlasting. And then Numbers, go to Numbers 35. Now I have these down here. One of them should say until the death of the high priest. Verse 25. Yeah, verse 25. The congregation shall deliver the slayer out of the hand of the revenger of blood, and the congregation shall restore him to the city of his refuge, whether he was fled, and he shall abide in it until the death of the high priest, which was anointed with the holy oil. So there's the death, until the death of. Meaning these other high priests were somehow appointed some other way. All right. Now, back, if you would, to John 18. John 18, verses 13 and 14, we had Ananias, Caiaphas. And we say that Caiaphas was priest for political reasons. Go to John 11. This is the one that Dana, you brought up, right? In that area. Yeah, in that area. And so Caiaphas is priest for political reasons. This would be one that would justify that political theory. Verse 47, then gathered the chief priests, the Pharisees, the council, said, what do we? For this man doeth many miracles. If we let him thus alone, all men will believe on him, and the Romans shall come and take away both our place and nation. Meaning, I guess you could say that the Romans put them in their place, appointed them in their place. And one of them, named Caiaphas, being the high priest that same year, said unto them, ye know nothing at all. All right, so that, and I have it marked all the way through verse 54. So the idea, it was to keep peace with Rome here. Verse 15, John 18, verse 15. And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. That disciple was known unto the high priest and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. All right, so the motive, I probably have this in some of my old notes from way back. His motive was in Matthew 26, verse 58. You know, if you compare all four accounts of this, you get different highlights. It was to see the, how did that phrase go? He wanted to see the what? You don't remember, if you were to quote the verse, can't quote it? He wanted to see the end. I was kind of hopeful that that would just come out, but it didn't. Matthew 26. His motive, he wanted to see the end. In fact, I'll turn there and read it. Matthew 26, verse 58. Verse 58. Peter followed him afar off unto the high priest's palace and went in and sat with his servants to see the end. So he had a motive. I've got these OM words here for an outline. His motive was to see the end. His motion was that of not a front slider, but a what? A backslider. The Christian walk, we are to we sit, stand, and walk. Sit, stand, and walk. When we go and do that study, who do we study out? That he first sat in the door, then he stood, and then he walked. Who did that? Anybody remember when the angels came? Abraham. He sat in the door, they come, then he stands, and then he walks. So it's sit, stand, and walk. Psalm 1, verse 1. It's opposite. Walk in the counsel of the ungodly, and they stand in. It goes backwards. It's walk, stand, and sit. And so that is the walk of the backslider, Psalm 1:1, and that's what Peter did. He walked in John 18. He then stood, and then he sat. It states that where he sat to see the end. And then the study that we do with Abraham is he sits, bows, stands, and walks. That's what it was. He sits, he bows, he stands, and he walks in that order. Now, those positions that are given, what epistle that Paul writes, do you get that sit, bow, stand, and walk? Anybody recall? In one of his epistles. It's in Ephesians. And we tend to go there for that. Why don't we go ahead? These Genesis ones are all in order. Genesis 18. Turn there if you would. Genesis 18. And I'm kind of surprised in this Bible I don't have it marked off. This would be a good one to mark off. I would like to think that I have marks on every page of my Bible. But since I've got this new Bible, and when I say new, I've probably had it 10 years, I don't have marks on every page. The sit is Genesis 18:1. The Lord appeared unto him in the plains of Mamre, and he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day. Verse 2, and he lifted up his eyes, looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him. When he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door and bowed himself toward the ground. You know, if somebody wants to get super critical about it, they can say, well, look, he ran there too. Well, but the point is that as a sinner, he sits. It's a type of getting saved. He sits, then he bows. You know, he's sitting in a sin. He bows in submission to our Lord. In verse 8, he then stands. He took butter and milk in the calf which he had dressed and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree, and they did eat. And then in verse 16, and the men rose up from thence and looked toward Sodom. Abraham went with them to bring them on the way. So he's walking with them. It doesn't actually say the word walk, but he's obviously serving and walking with them. Okay, so sit, bow, stand, and walk. That's the walk of a Christian. Now, a lot of times, that's what Christians do. They sit, they're sinners, then they bow, they become sinners saved by grace. They might stand and they might walk, but occasionally they do what Peter does, they go backwards. We tend to call it backsliding. How many times is backsliding used? Is it 13? I think it's 13 times. Anybody know there could be 3 books it's used. I think it's Proverbs, Jeremiah, and Hosea are the 3 books. It is only an Old Testament term. It is not a New Testament term. But saved people tend to do that. Can either stand still or go backwards at times. I do preach a message out of that. It was a Sam Gipp message. It was really a good one. He drew a picture. Yeah, I've done it here once. I think I was up there with this hill. We're going uphill. We're walking, towards Canaan. Going, if you walk to Jerusalem, any direction you go, which direction are you going? Up. All right. If you leave Jerusalem, you're going down. So it must be at a higher elevation. And he's got this sermon is what makes you go backwards. One was it was all S words. One was stuff, too much stuff. I thought it was a clever little sermon of everything that makes you as a Christian go sin, self, stuff. You can invent this. He invented it. And when he showed this fellow trying to push the as a heifer going backwards. I think that's the verse. I think it's in Hosea. Goes backslides. As it backslides down a hill, and he shows you trying to push it uphill. Anyway, Christians can do that. All right. Back, if you would, to John. We're going to skip some of this. It'll be in your notes. You can see. We've studied that sit, bow, stand, and walk out in the past many times. All right, John 18, verse 17. Then saith the damsel that kept the door unto Peter, art not thou also one of this man's disciples? He saith, I am not. So the girl speaks to John, and we'll look at that. He's the unnamed apostle here who knows the high priest. And we assume that John actually was one of these people that lived in Jerusalem. He actually lived, and his family was probably a little more affluent. He knows the high priest. He has access there. He gets to kind of come and go, and he introduces, spake unto her that kept the door. So he talks to the girl at the door, probably, hey, let him in. Let him in. Well, obviously, as soon as she knows John's one of the disciples, let him in. Well, then the girl's tipped off who he is. It's not a secret. She jumps to the conclusion, well, you must be one of them. And so he identifies Peter this way. I made a couple outlines by sect, by who he is associated with, by sect, by sound, and by sight. By sect, by sound, and by sight. By association, verses 15 through 17, Simon Peter followed Jesus. So did another disciple. That disciple was known unto the high priest and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door without. Then went out that other disciple, which was known unto the high priest, and spake unto her that kept the door, and brought in Peter. So John gives the girl the okay to let Peter in. Then saith the damsel that kept the door unto Peter, Art not thou also one of this man's disciples? He saith, I am not. So there's this first denial. So by sect or by association, he went to that Baptist church, or that he went there. And by association, he's got to be one of them. Mark 14, turn there if you would. Mark 14. In the identification of, I do a sermon. It's been a while since I preached. I probably preached it a couple of times. What you believe, your faith, what you do, and what you say. There's a few ways to do it. Every time they identify them for all three accounts, they identify them in a different way. Another way to preach that sermon, a different way. I've used this. You followed afar off. The other was, I can't remember my own sermon. The other was, it's right at the forefront, and I lost it. He follows afar off when you're, it escapes my mind. When you won't heed his warnings. A lot of people don't agree on this cock crowing. It said it crowed. Before it crows thrice, you'll deny me twice. You're far from him. When you're not close to Jesus, when you're far from him, that was the first one. When you won't heed his warnings. I remember now. When you're far from him, and there's a lot of Christians that are far from him, when you won't heed the warnings. So he heard the cock-a-doodle-doo. That's what a sermon is. It's a warning. The Bible is full of warnings. When you won't heed the warning signs, bridges out, and over it you go. Right? He did tip them off, cock-a-doodle-doo. And the other was when you fear man. Remember the last time? He was afraid. It states that. When you have the fear of man, you won't follow him either. He was afraid. All right, by sect, that's who he was associated by, because he was associated with the group. Verse 70, Mark 14, verse 70. And he denied again, and a little after that they stood by, said again to Peter, Surely thou art one of them, for thou art a Galilean, and thy speech agreeth thereto. So when we say Galilean, we say by verbalization, by sound, by sect, by sound. Now, how was the sound? In this particular case, how did they tell he was a Galilean? What would you say? Yeah, by the way, his accent, like, aye, laddie. Right? And if you have that, in your, it's hard not to talk like a West Virginian if you've grown up there. Right? To get that out of there, it takes a lot to get that out. So when they recruit people for the news media, what do they recruit?
Middle Westerners, Nebraskans.
They can recruit an Ohioan, West. If you go to Pittsburgh, you've already blown it. And it does not sound like West Virginia.
No.
It's already different. There's a certain twang there. That one's difficult for me to copy. There's a difference between Scots and Irish. It was that sound. It wasn't what he said. It was the way it sounded. Now, for us to be identified, if you have the pure dialect, it's what you said. Right? In other words, you said the name Jesus in an edifying way or an honoring way, but that's by sound. Okay? Luke 22. Go to Luke 22, verses 56 through 58. But a certain maid beheld him as he sat by the fire, and earnestly looked upon him and said, this man was also with him. Now that was by sight. By sect of who he was associated with, because he was associated with John as one of the disciples, by sect, by his association, by his sound, because he spoke Galilean, and the other was by sight. She looked on him. He looked different. He did not look the same. There's those three things about the denial. You could come up, now there's a sermon there. You could come up with different types of sermons. They're all different. All three different ways there. All right. And last of all, here we're way over, was the mess that he was in. I mean, Peter got himself in a jam here. He lost his, back if you would to John 18, and then we'll have a bunch of notes here next time for you. He lost his fellowship in verse 15. He followed, but he followed what? Afar off. So he lost the fellowship. He lost his authority. He couldn't get in. John had to get him in. He loses his boldness in verse 17. Peter was the bold as brass guy. He lost his convictions. He's sitting with the servants and officers of who he's now with, and he loses his testimony. He's warming himself by the devil's fire, right? So he lost all that, his fellowship, his authority, his boldness, his convictions, his testimony. Now, obviously, all these things you can get back. It's not like they're lost forever. And you and I, it's Christianity, you're going up, and then it's a plateau, then you're going up, and then you could go down. You don't want to do that, right? But grow in grace. We're to do that. And we'll pick it up here in verse 16 next week. And I will check out that thing about the high priest, see if there's anything worthwhile pursuing there. We'll preach in 15.